Let's speak now to Hannah Weisfeld, who is the executive director of Yachad, a British Jewish organisation which promotes a political resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Hannah, welcome back to the show. Thank you for
Hi,
agreeing
Nihal.
to come
Hi.
on. What is the Israeli Prime Minister's end game, Hannah? Has anyone really worked that out yet?
Well, it's a good question, and for those of your listeners who are following the news kind of day to day, you'll have seen that over the weekends there were mass protests against him in Israel, and a growing sense from the Israeli public that he doesn't really have an end game beyond making sure that he remains in power, and so he's under a huge amount of pressure. The hostage families came out and said a couple of days ago that it had now become clear that he was the blocker to a hostage deal, and that they were calling on the people of Israel to take to the streets to remove him from power because they saw that was their only way to get their loved ones home. So there is certainly a growing feeling in Israel that his end game is to prolong the war on the basis that while there is a war, his power is secure. And people might recall that he's under a lot of personal pressure because he's facing corruption charges. And so maintaining his coalition and keeping the government together is really critical for him.
We can't necessarily extrapolate from tens of thousands of people protesting against him that that's how the Israeli public feel. What are the polls saying in terms of faith in Benjamin Netanyahu?
Well, the polls would confirm that. So the polls are at an all-time low. He is polling incredibly badly, and if there were an election tomorrow, he wouldn't win. So Benny Gantz, who is in his war cabinet, would be the person most likely to replace him. He's not popular in lots of different pockets of Israeli society, so he's certainly not popular amongst the hostages and their families. He's also suffering a real crisis with the ultra-Orthodox religious part of his coalition, and that is quite a complex issue to do with the exemption of ultra-Orthodox men from military service, which is conscription in Israel. And a law exempting them has expired, which means that they are now no longer able to fund what are religious academies, basically, where they go and study, and they're going to have to start drafting them into the army, which and that inside Israeli society is a very contentious issue because the overwhelming majority of Israelis have to serve, in the army, and right now many soldiers are paying with their lives, and there is a real divide inside Israel as to why that segment, the ultra-Orthodox part of Israel society, should be exempt from the draft, and particularly at a moment of war, why they should be exempt.
Is that at all linked to the behaviour of settlers in the occupied West Bank at all, Hannah?
Well, kind of is the short answer, yes. But I guess the more complex answer.
This is a show that gives you time and space to be able to explain these things, so please do.
So in some respects, it's a completely different group of people. So what Benjamin Netanyahu has in his coalition is ultra-Orthodox Jews who are largely, I guess in some respects insular. They're primarily focused on religious study and actually to some extent are disengaged from the politics of the state, which is different from the far-right religious nationalists, which is people who your listeners may have heard of, people like Ben Gvir and Smotrich, who are the far right of Israel's cabinet. They are also religious, but they are religious nationalists, which is a different thing. And they are really, I would say, the kind of political leaders of the settler movement in the West Bank. And the settler movement is made up of a whole mix of people, but the people that listeners might have heard of are those who are violent settlers, some of whom have now been sanctioned actually by the UK government. And that far right, which is a growing minority, it's not such a small minority inside Israel anymore, is the bit that is holding the coalition together. And so Netanyahu needs all these different factions in his coalition. He needs the ultra-Orthodox Jews who are now angry with him over their drafting into the army. He needs the far right, the settler leaders, to hold the coalition together, and they are far right in every sense of the word. So, in relation to things like a hostage deal, they will be the most hawkish. he needs to be able to maintain all those different competing interests to hold his coalition together. And the general feeling inside Israel is that his primary motivation at the moment is holding his coalition together for his own benefits, which means that the ability he has to actually maneuver is actually quite limited if the way in which you're viewing the world, which he is I need to hold this thing together. So I need to work out how to manage my far right, who don't want to make a deal with Hamas, with my ultra-Orthodox members of the coalition, and then the general public, who are now back on the streets as they were pre-October the 7th, in their hundreds of thousands, blocking highways and really demanding that he stands down.
How does the Israeli public, and it's always, you can't talk about in public as some kind of amorphous blob that all move in the same direction, but react to the kind of arguments that, we need to have national unity at this time? The last thing we need is a change of administration when we are in the midst of a conflict brought on by this heinous attack on our people, which killed over 1,000 of our people on October the 7th. How does the Israeli public react to that argument?
Well, I think that the vast majority of the Israeli public were in that camp until not that long ago. So, I was there about a month ago, 6 weeks ago, and that is certainly what I heard from family members. It's certainly what I heard from some friends, that we are under attack. And actually, when a country is under attack, we have no choice almost but to put up and shut up. I think in the last 4-6 weeks, the feeling has really changed. And so I think that there is no longer that social cohesion that was there in kind of the first 4 months of the war. I think there is a growing sense that the war is not achieving its aims. I think actually the news in the last 12 hours about 7 aid workers being killed will probably have reverberations inside Israel, because it's very clear that and Israel has admitted that it was one of their bombs that killed them. That is something that the Israeli public is not used to seeing, because actually the way in which casualty figures are portrayed often in Israel is that it's Hamas fighters that are being killed, and there's often not very much debate about who it is who's dying in the war. That there is a perception inside Israel that the overwhelming majority of people being killed in Gaza are affiliated to Hamas, and the perception is very different inside Israel than it is for people outside Israel. But 7 aid workers who've been identified by foreign governments is a really different thing, because they're clearly not Hamas affiliated, and nobody can argue that they were. So that there is, it's just not there in the same way that it was, that feeling of we're under attack and you can't, we don't need to change in leadership. The people most affected by the war, which is the victims and the families of the hostages, are the people on the streets demanding that there is a change in government.
When we last spoke, I remember asking you how difficult it was to be a voice of moderation. And you said it's very difficult. How much more difficult is it now? How has it changed if you are trying to, as Yachad is trying to do, find a political resolution to the conflict?
Well, in some respects, it's as hard as it was, and in some respects, it's as hard as it's ever been. I do think there is one small silver lining, which is that the situation is so awful and it's so terrible for everybody caught up in it. And actually, I would add, it's obviously not the same being in the UK as it is being on the ground there. But there is a sense of people feeling really pressured, really under threat, Jews, Muslims, minority communities in this country, as a spillover. That I think there is a growing recognition that something has got to change, and that the status quo is just completely unacceptable. And I think that is something that moderates, whether it's us as Yachad, whether it's our partners in the region and other partners here in the UK, can capitalise on, which is to say that the status quo that was in operation on October the 6th has brought upon the region a complete disaster for both peoples. And there is a consensus that we cannot, the day after the war, go back to October the 6th. And I think that is a window of opportunity amongst all the bleakness and amongst all the death and destruction that we've not seen for decades. And I think that the challenge now is, how do you make sure that into the space of a post-war reality, whenever that comes, that it's moderates that basically guide the agenda as opposed to extremists that have got us to the point we're at today.
When there is Sorry, carry on.
No, go on, carry on.
When there is a large pro-Palestinian demonstration taking place in London on a weekend afternoon, do you feel safe to venture into central London? Would you feel safe?
Yes, I've been asked this question. I can't tell you countless times, and especially in the media. And I think it is really important to be clear, which is that we cannot be in a situation where we pit the democratic right of people to protest against the right that people have and Jews have to feel safe and secure. And at the moment, where this debate has gone is to a space which says those two things are a zero-sum game, yes. Which is that either you're in the camp of saying anti-Semitism is unacceptable and actually it's wrong that Jews feel unsafe and therefore there shouldn't be protesters, or you're in the camp of saying people have a democratic right to protest and support the Palestinian people and therefore you're somehow in support of anti-Semitism. And that is just not the case at all.
No, it's not.
And actually, it's a really dangerous path to go down, because once you go down that path where you say that minority rights are in competition with each other, it is a zero-sum game, and you pit minorities against each other and you make people choose. And actually what really needs to happen is that we need to be able to say there are pockets of those demonstrations in which people shout anti-Semitic slogans, hold anti-Semitic signs, that is really uncomfortable for people to be around and actually unacceptable on the streets of Britain. Those people and those pockets of demonstrators should be dealt with to the full extent of the law. And the more we keep on saying that it's not safe as a Jew to go into central London, the more of a self-fulfilling prophecy it becomes.
Right.
So the more you say to people you can't go, it's dangerous, the more people don't go. And then they suddenly say, I've not been in London for 3 months now because I feel scared. And then it does become a place that you can't go.
Yes.
And so I think actually it's about lowering the heat of the discussion and working out what is, how you deal with the problematic spaces and the people behind them, and simultaneously saying to the Jewish community that you are welcome in central London and this is your home and you have a right to be on the streets as much as anyone else does, and actually suggesting that it's either or is just fundamentally wrong.
Indeed. I think the CEO of JW3, the Jewish Cultural Centre in North London,
yes.
was adamant when a newspaper ran a sensationalist headline about London being a no-go area for Jews. He was adamant that was not the case, and he didn't base that just on his own experience, but those of people who attend JW3, the Jewish communities in London that he's very much a part of, and he wanted to kind of counter that narrative.
Yeah, and I would add, and this is obviously purely anecdotal and based on my own personal life experience, but I live in North London, which is a relatively Jewish area, but I happen to live in a very un-Jewish neighbourhood, and my kids are at our local school, and my personal experience has been that in our neighbourhood, it's been nothing other than people expressing concern, asking questions. Everybody knows what I do for my job, and they ask me, they're interested in what I'm doing and how it's going, and are very sympathetic to the challenges that we face. And so my personal experience in a very non-Jewish part of London has been very positive for the last 6 months. And I recognise it's not the same for everybody,
no,
and you
not.
can't, not one person will have the same experience. But I think there is a danger that we create a scenario in which communities are completely isolated because we paint a picture that is how it is when it's actually not.
But equally, I'm saddened by my friend's son who hides his Star of David, doesn't wear his kippah because he's scared.
Yeah, and people are scared, and it's really important that is not, people don't diminish that reality, that people are scared, people are fearful. But I would add, and I think this is really important, is that it's still the case that the overwhelming majority, if we go back to those protesters, or people that are out on the streets are protesting because they don't like the war and they want it to stop. Whether or not you agree or disagree with that analysis and the conclusion those people have come to is a different thing from whether you are scared. And I think that there is, in some of the rhetoric around this issue of how safe are the streets, it's been taken to a place which says that all of those people that are protesting in their hundreds of thousands are protesting because they don't like Jews. And that is just not true. And actually, in any future peace agreement in the region, there will be a flag of Palestine and a flag of Israel that are raised side by side, because there will be a country of Palestine and next to a country of Israel. And right now, in the middle of a war, people feel quite afraid of those national symbols. But in the long term, being able to raise both an Israeli flag and a Palestinian flag, and both peoples being able to call Jerusalem their capital city, and both people having, secure borders and safety and dignity and freedom and states of their own, is going to be what makes both people safer. Mm-hmm. And so, and I think that often gets lost in this conversation, that there will be no safety for Israelis without security for Palestinians, and there will be no freedom for Palestinians without security for Israelis. And that is ultimately where we have all got to take the region and be part of finding that solution. And if we can't uphold both sides of that equation, this war will continue, ad infinitum. And so actually we need to get to a place where people feel comfortable with an Israeli flag and a Palestinian flag, because that's the only future that is going to bring peace for anybody.
Yes, I interviewed the mother of an Israeli soldier, her eldest child, who was killed on October the 7th, who said exactly that. Exactly that. She said there will be no peace for my children until there is peace for Palestinians. So, Hannah, please.
I just end by saying that there are no better advocates for that future than the victims of this conflict on the Israeli side. So many of the peace camp were killed, abducted, on October the 7th, and their voices are the people that we should be listening to right now.
Hannah, stay with us. Let's bring in Bradley Bowman now, who's director of the Centre on Military and Political Power at the Foundation for Defence of Democracies in Washington. Well, Bradley, we need to get a snappier title there. He served as a senior advisor to the Senate on national security and is a former US Army officer. So, Bradley, firstly, thank you so much for joining us today from the Centre on Military and Political Power at the Foundation for Defence of Democracies in Washington. Bradley, how do you assess Israel's military operations in Gaza?
Thank you for the opportunity to join you, and I appreciated Ms. Weisfeld's comments there. I would, from a military perspective, as a former U.S. Army officer taught at West Point, I would say that the Israel Defense Forces operations in Gaza have gone quicker than most expected, and have been more successful in destroying elements of Hamas in Gaza, and the Israelis have done so with fewer casualties than many expected. Now, every casualty is horrible, particularly for the family. Yeah, no, absolutely. When you consider that I'm talking about Israeli IDF casualties, military casualties, not Palestinian casualties.
Okay, right. Yeah, sorry. An important clarification.
Yeah, important indeed, and I'm happy to talk about that as well. From an Israeli perspective, assessing the performance of the IDF, I'm saying that their progress against Hamas has gone quicker than most military experts would have predicted, and the IDF casualties have been fewer. Why is that? Well, Gaza, as your listeners know by now, is one of the most dense urban environments in the world. Hundreds of miles in underground tunnels against a determined adversary that has had years to prepare all kinds of booby traps and improvise explosive devices and traps and so forth. And so we've seen a significant portion of Hamas's combat power destroyed, but you still see a lot of it existing. And you have the question of Rafah, which is obviously foremost in the debate, the international debate, the debate here in the United States, and in the decision-making among Israel's leadership.
What about the winning of hearts and minds, a term, of course, used in the campaign in Iraq, in the 2003 invasion and occupation of Iraq? Do you think Israel is succeeding in winning hearts and minds, Bradley?
It's a fair question. And, most of my life when I heard that term, it was in the context of America's experience in Iraq and Afghanistan. So I'm very familiar with the concept. And when I talk I'm very mindful that, both Hannah and I are sharing anecdotal experiences, and I don't want to over extrapolate it. I want to be precise. But when I talk to Israeli national security professionals, which are probably, in the center of the political spectrum by and large, these current and former leaders in their national security establishment. They are. That's not their first concern. They recognize that for every Hamas terrorist, of course, Hamas is a designated foreign terrorist organization by the United States and many of our European allies,
including the UK.
Yes, and how you do that matters. I mean, how you do that matters, right? Because if you kill one terrorist and in the process you do it in a way that creates more, then you're in this never-ending cycle. So it's a serious question. But, my sense is that October 7th was some combination for Israelis of Pearl Harbor and 9/11 in terms of the psychological shock. And it really shattered widespread assumptions and made the status quo unacceptable, the status quo both in Gaza and the status quo in southern Lebanon. And so people, if you catch them in a non-passionate moment, would admit the validity of your question, that hearts and minds and how you go about killing terrorists matters, and are you creating more in the process? But they'd say more important that is survival, and they view this really as an existential fight for the right of Israel to exist. And so it sounds a little dismissive when you hear it, but I totally get it as someone who lived through 9/11 here and has studied military history. The first priority is survival, and if you don't have survival, everything else is kind of details.
But what about revenge and not falling into potentially it looking like pure vengeance? And that is something that off the record has been reported that President Biden has advised the Israeli state against, which is revenge and, as you're a military historian, the sense that after 9/11 it was revenge, and look what that unleashed in Iraq.
Yeah, no, I wouldn't choose that phrasing myself, either for America's actions after 9/11. Certainly, were there some Americans that wanted revenge? Of course. I mean, this was 9/11 was a psychological shock for Americans that I lived through. We thought we were safe in our country, and in reality, we weren't. And we wanted to know who did it, and we wanted to go get them to prevent them from doing it again. Sounds a little bit familiar, doesn't it, after October 7th in terms of how Israelis feel. And I think that's very understandable. So for one person, that might be revenge. For me, as a person of faith, I'd say revenge kind of hurts the person feeling it more than the person being targeted. So you want to avoid revenge. But nation states like the United States, like Britain, like Israel, have a right to exist. And if you have an adversary, namely the Islamic Republic of Iran, that is using terror proxies to try to exterminate the state of Israel, then Israel has a right and indeed an obligation as the only majority Jewish nation in the world to defend itself. And if you're conducting a war in one of the most dense urban environments in the world, then you're going to have a lot of horrible images coming out there. If Israel did everything perfectly from a military perspective, then you would still have an enormous number of civilian casualties. That's just the reality. And when you combine that with Hamas's systematic use of human shields, it dramatically increases it. So no one can deny that the Palestinian casualties in Gaza are horrific, that they're too high. The humanitarian conditions are just horrible. Anyone with a heart and any level of empathy has to see that and recognize it. The question is, why is that happening? And I thought what Hannah said was so right. She said we cannot go back to October 6th. I agree. From an American national security perspective, from an Israeli perspective, with the Israelis I talked to, that's so right. And I tend, for my part, I agree that we need to move towards some sort of two-state solution. And there's impediments to that. And I would say a leading or even the leading impediment to moving significantly toward a two-state solution are groups like Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad, who refuse to recognize Israel's right to exist. And as long as you have them with that ideology armed to the teeth by Iran and others, then it's going to feed the far right in Israel and create this never-ending cycle that's going to make life just horrible for Palestinians and as we saw on October 7th, also for Israelis.
But of course, as you are from the military and political power Foundation for Defense Democracies in Washington, what about that lurch to the far right in Israel and that as being a barrier to negotiations? Because ultimately there have to be negotiations. I read an article in Haaretz which was talking about how actually Benjamin Netanyahu wasn't interested in a two-state solution. And that is where we are now, because any conversation around peace, reconciliation, and a two-state solution was essentially moribund.
Yeah, my sense is that anyone pushing for like a two-state solution in the short term is a little tone deaf.
This isn't the short term, though, Bradley. This is something that has been discussed for decades. You have to look at the Oslo Accords, for instance.
Yeah, no, of course. No, of course. I mean, what I said and what you said are not inconsistent.
No.
I'm not in all saying that it started yesterday. I'm saying anyone right now, in light of what happened on October 7th and the existence and goals of Hamas, pushing Israel to move in the short term toward a two-state solution, mindful of the fact that this is a decades-long process, is tone deaf in terms of understanding how most Israelis are feeling about this and frankly, the prospects for any tangible progress if you don't destroy Hamas. I'm going to say something that some might find controversial, but I think it's true. So it's worth saying, is that anyone who really wants peace between Israelis and Palestinians, who really wants to move toward a two-state solution and have sustainable peace, should support giving Israel the time and the space and the means to destroy Hamas. Easier said than done, but I just don't see a practical path forward toward a two-state solution.
How do you destroy an idea? I mean, people would say that, look, the Americans put up a banner saying mission accomplished on a warship, right? And we all know how that panned out, right? I don't think we can argue specifically with what's happened in Moscow recently that ISIS no longer exist. So how do you destroy an idea?
Actually, the ISIS caliphate no longer exists. The ISIS terrorist organization does. Well, let me finish. I'm getting to that. Sure. You're exactly right. The idea does. Now, I would ideally militaries, American military, the British military, the Israeli military, are notoriously horrible at dealing with ideas. If you want to make a short list of why the United States has struggled in Iraq and struggled in Afghanistan, it was our inability to get after the ideology. But I'd say, so your point is taken. There's real merit in what you're saying. But I would respond with this: is that maybe a military can't deal with the ideology, but you can try to deprive the murderers of the means of murder. And so what does that mean? That means Israelis have to prevent Hamas's ability to continue to replenish itself with additional weapons. So that either means taking Rafah or having a zone where you have Israelis in militarily in control of the border coming across from Egypt so they can prevent additional weapons and munitions coming into Hamas to conduct the next October 7th. So I take your point. Militaries are not good at dealing with ideologies. That gets into the political sphere very quickly. But at a minimum, as an interim step, deprive the terrorists of the means of murder. And that's something that militaries can do.
Hannah, would you like to come in to comment on some of the things that Bradley said?
Yeah, couple of points, which is firstly this question about leadership and, extremism, in the Israeli government and Hamas being in power. I think that often that governs the response of the international community, or to be more precise, acts as an excuse for not doing anything. And so we've seen, decades basically of international inaction. And often the reason is, well, it's not the right people in power. Netanyahu is not interested in peace, and now the far-right coalition is not interested in peace. Hamas is there, they're not interested in peace. There's no point in doing anything. There is an awful lot of stuff that the international community could be doing right now and could have been doing for decades to make it clear to the region that it will only accept one long-term outcome, which is two states for two people. And so whether that is recognition of Palestine, helping Israel to secure its borders, banning the import of West Bank settlement produce to make it clear that that is land, settlements are built on land destined for a future Palestinian state. There's a whole long list of policies that I could go into that the international community could get behind right now, today, and it's irrelevant whether Hamas is in power or Benjamin Netanyahu is in power. Global leaders have chosen to ignore this conflict, and at our peril, our global peril, will we ignore it again? Because the world is much less safe today than it was on October the 6th. That's the first point. But the second thing, just to kind of push back a little bit on this question of can a military ignore an ideology or destroy one? I think it's a mistake to divorce a military strategy from a political one. because actually this question of how many new recruits for Hamas will there be in Gaza is something that I think about constantly. The level of death and destruction in Gaza and the level of human misery that has now been brought upon over 2 million people, I think is incredibly dangerous, for Israel's security, if you want to talk about it through that lens and putting aside the devastating impact it's had on the Palestinian people. But if you want to look at it through a security lens, the idea that Israel will be safer as a result of this military operation, I find very difficult to believe. And it may well be safer in the short term, when weapons caches are destroyed and tunnels are destroyed. But the idea that you have 2.5 million people, nearly 2.5 million people living on your border who blame you, the Israeli government and the Israeli people, for the human suffering that they have lived through, I think that it is a mistake to suggest that a military can operate in a vacuum. And I think that it's really crucial that when we look at this conflict, that we think about not just what brings short-term security, but what is going to bring long-term peace.
We pretty much run out of time, but Bradley, if you do want to make a last point very quickly.
I would love to respond to that.
Quickly.
So I am in no way suggesting that the military ignore ideology, and I'm no way suggesting that it should operate in a vacuum. Karl von Clausewitz, the Prussian theorist, talked about war as politics and policy by other means. The purpose is to win a better peace. But in terms of what you ask the military to do, militaries are horrible at engaging in the war of ideology. They're much better at destroying terrorists who want to kill Israel. So I'm saying the military measures are necessary but not sufficient. I completely agree that you have to go after the ideology, but the first step is to provide the terrorists deprive them of the means of murder.
Yeah. Okay. Well, look, thank you so much, Bradley, for being on the show today. This is a conversation we could have had for an entire hour without question. So thank you for your valuable input. Bradley Bowman there, Director of the Centre on Military and Political Power at the Foundation for Defence of Democracies in Washington. And also thank you very much indeed to Hannah Weisfeld as well, who's the Executive Director of Yachad, a British Jewish organisation which promotes a political resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.